March 15th, 1994. Dr. Margaret Thornfield sat across from John Wayne Gacy for the last time. He slid a folded piece of paper across the metal table. "When you're ready to remember," he whispered, "this will help." Security guards rushed in. Gacy was dragged back to his cell. Margaret never opened that paper. She buried it in her case files and tried to forget. 29 years later, that same paper arrived in her mailbox with a simple note: "The drawings are waiting." Inside Menard's abandoned solitary wing, Margaret found walls covered in intricate sketches, houses, streets, faces, all leading to one address: her childhood home, the place where her sister vanished. Someone had been orchestrating this moment for decades. Someone who knew exactly what Margaret had witnessed as a child. And now they were ready to collect. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The hook. The beam from Margaret's flashlight trembled against the concrete wall, illuminating the final sketch in the sequence. A little girl with pigtails standing at a bus stop. The same bus stop where 8-year-old Sarah Thornfield had disappeared on October 13th, 1983. Margaret's breath came in short gasps. The abandoned solitary wing of Menard pressed in around her like a tomb, the air thick with decades of despair and madness. But it was the precision of the drawing that made her legs shake, every detail perfect, down to the crack in the sidewalk and the rust stain on the stop sign. A metallic clang echoed from somewhere deeper in the cell block. Margaret spun around, her flashlight cutting through the darkness. "Hello?" Her voice bounced off the walls, distorted and hollow. Nothing but silence answered back. She turned to examine the wall again, but froze. There, in the corner of the sketch she'd somehow missed before, were 2 initials carved into the concrete with what looked like a fingernail. Margaret Thornfield. The flashlight slipped from her numb fingers, clattering to the floor. In the strobing light as it rolled, the drawing seemed to move, to breathe. Gacy's crude but methodical artwork formed a timeline along the wall. Her sister walking home from school, approaching the bus stop, a dark sedan pulling up, a man's silhouette in the driver's seat, and in the final panel, barely visible in the dancing shadows, another figure. A child watching from behind a tree, a witness. The memory hit her like physical blow. She was 9 years old again, hiding behind the old oak tree, watching Sarah talk to the man in the car. She'd promised to walk Sarah home from ballet practice, but Margaret had gotten distracted by a comic book and arrived late. So late that all she could do was watch in frozen terror as her sister climbed into that sedan. She'd run home and told her parents Sarah never came out of dance class. The teacher said Sarah had left on time. The police searched everywhere except the route Margaret had never mentioned, the shortcut past the bus stop where Sarah sometimes waited when she missed the school bus. Margaret had buried the memory so deep she'd convinced herself it never happened. Another sound from the darkness, the scrape of footsteps on concrete. "Who's there?" Margaret grabbed her flashlight, the beam wild and erratic as her hands shook. "I know someone's there." The footsteps stopped. Margaret backed toward the cell entrance, but her path was blocked. A shadow moved across the doorway, tall, deliberate, patient. "Dr. Thornfield." The voice was soft, almost gentle. A man's voice, aged and weathered. "After all these years, you finally came home." Margaret pressed herself against the wall, Gacy's drawings rough against her back. "You're him. You're the one who—" "Who what, Margaret? Say it. Who took Sarah?" A low chuckle echoed through the cell. "I didn't take her. She came willingly, just like you will." The shadow stepped into the cell, and Margaret's flashlight revealed a man in his 70s, average height, kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He looked like someone's grandfather, harmless, forgettable. "You've been watching me," Margaret whispered. "Studying you, just like you studied Gacy, just like you studied all of them, trying to understand what makes someone like me. But you never could see it, could you? The connection. Why you were drawn to this work, why you spent 30 years diving into the minds of killers." He took another step closer. Margaret noticed he was wearing latex gloves. "Because you were always meant to be here, Margaret, in this cell, with these drawings." Gacy understood that. He was my student, you might say, a crude apprentice, but effective. When I visited him in 1994, he told me about the brilliant psychiatrist who was so close to remembering, so close to understanding. The paper, Margaret gasped. The note he gave me, my phone number, my address, instructions for when you were ready. But you buried it instead, just like you buried what you saw that day. So I had to find another way to bring you home. Margaret's mind raced. The inheritance, the prison wing. You arranged it all. I've had 40 years to plan this reunion, Margaret. 40 years to perfect my craft. Your sister was just the beginning. There have been so many others since then. All practice for this moment. The old man reached into his jacket, and Margaret saw the glint of metal. Not a gun. Something worse. A syringe. Don't worry, he said, moving closer. You'll see Sarah soon. I've kept her drawings too. The ones she made while she was learning. While she was becoming what I needed her to become. Margaret's scream died in her throat. Sarah was alive. After 40 years, Sarah was alive, and Margaret was about to join her. Tomorrow we'll dive deeper into Margaret's past and discover exactly how this nightmare began. If you're feeling the tension building, make sure you're following along, because what Margaret finds next will change everything she thought she knew about evil. Introduction. The syringe caught the dying flashlight beam, its needle glinting like a silver promise of oblivion. Margaret's mind fractured into 1,000 fragments. 40 years of buried guilt, 30 years of studying monsters, and now this moment where her past finally caught up with her professional life in the cruelest possible way. Sarah, she whispered, the name cutting through her terror like a prayer. What did you do to her? The old man's smile was grandfatherly, patient, the kind of expression she'd seen across interview tables for decades, worn by men who spoke of unspeakable things with the same tone they might use to discuss the weather. I taught her, Margaret, just like I'm going to teach you. He moved closer, his footsteps echoing in the concrete tomb. She was so young when she came to me, impressionable, eager to please. By the time she understood what was happening, she was already mine. Margaret's back pressed against Gacy's drawings, the rough concrete scraping through her jacket. Her fingers searched desperately along the wall, feeling for anything, a loose stone, a piece of rebar, anything that might serve as a weapon. Instead, her palm found something else. Something that made her breath catch. Fresh chalk dust. The drawings weren't 40 years old. Someone had been maintaining them, adding to them. Recently, you've been coming here, she realized, even after Gacy died. You've been coming here and working on them. This is my gallery, Margaret, my memorial to our relationship, yours, mine, and Sarah's. His voice carried a twisted fondness, like a curator discussing his favorite exhibit. Gacy was useful for a time, but he lacked subtlety, vision. He saw killing as the end goal, not understanding that death is just the beginning of the real work. Margaret's mind raced through every case file she'd ever studied, every interview she'd conducted, searching for the psychological profile that might save her life. Narcissistic personality disorder, grandiose delusions, the need to be seen, understood, appreciated for his work. The other victims you mentioned, she said, forcing her voice to remain steady. How many were there? Curious even now. That's what I always admired about you. He paused, tilting his head as if considering whether to indulge her. 17, including Sarah. Though she was never really a victim, was she? More of a collaborator. The number hit Margaret like a physical blow. 17 people who had vanished while she'd spent decades studying killers in sterile interview rooms, never realizing the one she should have been looking for was already watching her. The inheritance, she said, stalling for time, while her fingers continued their desperate search along the wall. How did you arrange it? Who are you? Does it matter now? He raised the syringe, checking the fluid inside with clinical precision. Names are just labels we wear for the outside world. I've been many people over the years. A lawyer who helped draft a will, a prison administrator who preserved certain cells from demolition, a benefactor who believed in your research. Margaret's hand found something, a loose chunk of concrete about the size of her fist. She palmed it carefully, keeping it hidden behind her back. But underneath all those roles, he continued, I've always been the same person, The man who saw potential in a frightened little girl hiding behind a tree. The man who knew that someday you'd need to understand what really happened that day. The flashlight flickered once more and died, plunging them into absolute darkness. Margaret heard the man's breathing, steady and calm, somewhere to her left. He'd done this before, many times. The darkness didn't frighten him. "It's better this way." His voice floated through the black air. "In the dark you can focus on what really matters. Memory, truth, the moment your life changed forever." Margaret gripped the concrete chunk tighter, her heart hammering against her ribs. Somewhere in Chicago, her colleagues at the Psychiatric Institute were probably wondering why she hadn't returned their calls. Her assistant, Janet, would be worried about the canceled appointments. Dr. Harrison would be expecting her research notes on the Kemper interviews. A life. A quiet, careful life she'd built around the absence of her sister, around the guilt she'd buried so deep she'd forgotten it existed. 30 years of studying monsters to understand the one who'd taken Sarah. And now she was about to lose everything. Not just her life, but the terrible knowledge that Sarah was alive somewhere, shaped by 4 decades of this man's influence. The sound of footsteps moved closer in the darkness. Margaret could smell him now, old cologne, stale cigarettes, and something else. Something that reminded her of the chemistry lab at the institute. "Don't fight this, Margaret," he whispered, so close now she could feel his breath against her cheek. "Sarah's waiting for you. She's been waiting for so long." The needle pierced her neck before she could swing the concrete. As consciousness slipped away, Margaret's last thought was a memory. Sarah's laugh echoing through their childhood home, bright and innocent and forever lost. Inciting incident. Margaret's consciousness returned in fragments. First the taste of copper in her mouth, then the sensation of cold air against her skin. Finally, the realization that she was moving, not walking, being carried. Her eyelids felt weighted with lead, but she forced them open to narrow slits. Fluorescent lights strobed overhead in a rhythmic pattern, creating a disorienting tunnel of brightness and shadow. The smell of disinfectant mixed with something organic and rotten, like flowers left too long in stagnant water. She was in a wheelchair, her hands zip-tied to the armrests, her ankles bound to the footrests. The old man pushed her down what appeared to be a hospital corridor, though the walls were covered with the same kind of drawings she'd seen in Gacy's cell. Children's faces, locations, dates, a timeline of horror spanning decades. "Ah, you're awake," his voice came from behind her, still carrying that grandfatherly warmth that made her skin crawl. Perfect timing. "We're almost there." Margaret tried to speak, but her tongue felt thick and unresponsive. The sedative, whatever he'd used, was still working through her system, leaving her thoughts scattered and her body uncooperative. "Sarah will be so excited to see you," he continued conversationally as they turned a corner. "She's been preparing for this day for years, drawing her own pictures, making plans. She's become quite the artist herself, though her style is darker than mine." They stopped in front of a heavy steel door marked with the number 17. Margaret's blood turned to ice. The 17th victim. Sarah. The old man moved around to face her, and in the harsh fluorescent light she could see him clearly for the first time. He was younger than she'd initially thought, perhaps mid-60s rather than 70s. His eyes, which had seemed kind in the darkness, now revealed their true nature, intelligent, calculating, utterly devoid of empathy. She'd seen eyes like that in interview rooms, but never directed at her with such personal intensity. "Before we go in," he said, crouching down to her eye level, "I should probably tell you my name. After 40 years, you deserve that much courtesy." He smiled, and Margaret noticed his teeth were perfectly white. Too perfect. Dentures. "Dr. Edmund Rothschild. I was the child psychologist who evaluated you after Sarah's disappearance." The memory crashed over her like a tsunami. She was 9 years old again, sitting in an office that smelled like vanilla candles and old books. A kind man with wire-rimmed glasses, asking gentle questions about her sister, about what she remembered, about why she seemed so frightened. Her parents had insisted she see someone to help with the trauma. He'd been there all along. In her life, in her memories, shaping her responses to the tragedy. The very man who had taken Sarah had been the one tasked with helping Margaret recover from the loss. "You recommended the psychiatric program at Northwestern," Margaret managed to whisper. her voice hoarse. You guided my entire career. I shaped you, Margaret. Every choice you made, every killer you studied, every sleepless night you spent trying to understand the criminal mind, it was all part of the design. His fingers traced along her cheek with mock tenderness. I needed you to become the perfect witness, someone who could truly appreciate the scope of my work. Dr. Rothschild stood and produced a key from his pocket. Sarah understood this from the beginning. That's why she never tried to escape, never fought back after the first few months. She realized she was part of something magnificent, a long-term study in trauma, control, and psychological evolution. The door swung open with a metallic groan. The room beyond was exactly what Margaret's worst nightmares had conjured for 40 years. A basement-level space lit by dozens of candles, their flickering light dancing across walls covered floor to ceiling with artwork. But these weren't the crude sketches from Gacy's cell. These were sophisticated, detailed, beautiful in their technical execution, and horrifying in their subject matter. And in the center of the room, sitting at an easel with her back to the door, was a woman with graying blonde hair tied in a neat ponytail. She wore a simple blue dress and held a paintbrush delicately between her fingers, working on a canvas Margaret couldn't quite see. "Sarah," Dr. Rothschild called softly. "Your sister is here." The woman turned around, and Margaret's heart stopped. It was Sarah's face, but 40 years older, lined, weathered, marked by decades of captivity. But the eyes, those were still the same bright blue eyes Margaret remembered from childhood, though now they held something that made her want to scream, recognition and joy. "Maggie," Sarah said, using the nickname she'd called her as a child. "I've been waiting for you for so long. Look what I've learned to do." She turned the easel around, revealing a perfect portrait of Margaret as she was now. 58 years old, terrified, strapped to a wheelchair in a basement that reeked of death and madness. Margaret's scream finally found her voice, echoing off the walls and mixing with Sarah's delighted laughter. Her old life, her careful, controlled existence built on buried memories, was truly over. Margaret's scream died in her throat, leaving only the sound of her ragged breathing and the soft drip of water somewhere in the darkness beyond the candlelight. Sarah's laughter faded into an expectant silence, as if she were waiting for some response, some recognition of her artistic achievement. "No," Margaret whispered, shaking her head against the restraints. "This isn't real. This can't be real." But the woman before her moved with Sarah's familiar gestures, the way she tilted her head when concentrating, how she held her brush like a pencil, the way their art teacher had scolded her about in 3rd grade. 40 years of captivity hadn't erased those small, heartbreaking details. Dr. Rothschild wheeled Margaret closer to the easel. "Sarah has become quite accomplished. Show her the others, dear." Sarah stood with fluid grace and began lighting additional candles around the room. As the space brightened, Margaret saw the true scope of the artwork covering every surface. Dozens of portraits lined the walls, men, women, children of various ages, all rendered with the same technical skill, all capturing something in their subjects' eyes that made Margaret's stomach clench. Terror. Pure, absolute terror. "These are the others," Sarah said, her voice carrying the same melodic quality Margaret remembered, but with an undertone that hadn't been there in childhood. Something flat and distant. "I've painted them all. Every one of Edmund's students. Students, not victims." Margaret forced herself to look closer at the portraits, recognizing the clinical detachment in Sarah's technique. This wasn't the work of someone forced to document her captor's crimes. This was collaboration. "Sarah," Margaret tried to reach her sister through the years of conditioning. "Do you remember our house on Maple Street? The tire swing Dad built in the backyard? You used to pretend it was a spaceship." For a moment, something flickered across Sarah's face. A ghost of the girl who had shared Margaret's bedroom, who had whispered secrets in the dark, who had promised they'd be sisters forever no matter what. Then Dr. Rothschild placed a gentle hand on Sarah's shoulder, and the moment vanished. "The past is just preparation," Sarah recited, as if repeating a well-worn lesson. "What matters is the work, the understanding." Margaret felt panic clawing at her chest. "What did you do to her? How did you make her like this?" "Time," Dr. Rothschild said simply. "Time and patience and a deep understanding of psychological conditioning." Sarah was 7 when she came to me. Young enough to be taught, old enough to remember her choices. I never broke her, Margaret. I simply helped her become what she was always meant to be. He moved to a table covered with art supplies and what looked like medical instruments. The first few years were challenging, of course. Sarah cried for you constantly, for your parents, for her old life. But eventually she understood that her family had abandoned her, that no one was coming to save her. We looked for her. Margaret's voice cracked. We never stopped looking. Did you? Sarah's voice was curious, clinical. Edmund showed me the newspaper articles. The searches stopped after 6 months. The police declared me dead after 2 years. You all moved on. The words hit Margaret like physical blows, because they were true. After the initial frantic searching, after the media attention faded, life had slowly, inexorably returned to a new kind of normal. Her parents had moved to Florida when Margaret was 16, unable to bear living in the house where Sarah's absence echoed in every room. Margaret had thrown herself into her studies, into understanding the criminal mind, telling herself it was for Sarah when really it was to escape the guilt. I tried to find you, Margaret whispered, but the words sounded hollow even to her own ears. Sarah returned to her easel and picked up her brush. Edmund never lied to me, not once. He told me exactly what would happen, and it always did. He said you'd become a psychiatrist. He said you'd study killers your whole life, searching for him without knowing it. And he said that eventually you'd come here. Dr. Rothschild approached Margaret's wheelchair with something in his hand, a small recording device. I think it's time Sarah heard the truth about that day, don't you? The real truth about why no one could find her. Margaret's blood turned to ice. No, please. Tell her, Margaret. Tell Sarah why you were late walking her home from dance class. Tell her where you were when she needed you most. The recording device clicked on, and Margaret realized with sick certainty that he'd been planning this moment for decades. Every word, every revelation, orchestrated to cause maximum psychological damage. Sarah had stopped painting and was watching Margaret with those 2 bright eyes, waiting for an answer that would destroy whatever was left of the bond between them. In the candlelight, surrounded by portraits of the dead and the woman her sister had become, Margaret understood that her attempts at resistance were futile. Dr. Rothschild hadn't brought her here to kill her. He'd brought her here to complete Sarah's education, and Margaret was about to become both teacher and lesson. Margaret's throat constricted as if invisible hands were squeezing the life from her. The recording device sat in Dr. Rothschild's palm like a small black judgment, waiting to broadcast the truth she'd buried so deep it had calcified into her bones. She started, then stopped. Sarah's paintbrush hung motionless in the air, a drop of crimson paint threatening to fall. The silence stretched between them, heavy with 40 years of suppressed memory. She was with Tommy Morrison, Dr. Rothschild said when Margaret couldn't continue. His voice carried the satisfied tone of a professor delivering a well-rehearsed lecture. Behind the gymnasium after school, kissing a boy while her 7-year-old sister waited outside the dance studio. The words struck Sarah like physical blows. Her brush clattered to the floor, leaving a splash of red across the concrete that looked disturbingly like blood. Tell her the rest, Margaret, Dr. Rothschild pressed. Tell her how you checked your watch and knew you were 20 minutes late. How you ran to the studio and found it empty. How you lied to your parents about where you'd been. Margaret's vision blurred with tears she hadn't allowed herself to shed in decades. Sarah, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I was supposed to be there. I was supposed to protect you. But Sarah wasn't looking at her anymore. She was staring at the recording device with the fascination of a child watching a magic trick. He knew, she whispered. Edmund knew before I ever told him. How did you know? Because I was there, Dr. Rothschild said gently. Waiting, watching. I'd been watching your family for months, studying the patterns. I knew Margaret would be late eventually. Teenage girls always are. I just had to be patient. The revelation hit Margaret like ice water in her veins. You planned it, all of it. You knew my schedule. Knew I was seeing Tommy. I made sure you were seeing Tommy, he corrected. A few carefully placed words to the right friends, a suggestion here and there about how mature you were for your age. Children are so easy to manipulate when you understand their psychology. Sarah's breathing had become shallow, rapid. For the first time since Margaret had seen her again, cracks appeared in the serene mask she wore. You made her abandon me? I created the circumstances. Margaret made the choice. Dr. Rothschild's clinical detachment was more chilling than any rage could have been. Just as she's made choices every day since. To bury the guilt. To study killers instead of looking for the one who took you. To build a life on the foundation of your disappearance. Margaret watched in horror as something shifted in Sarah's expression, not toward her, but toward their shared captor. You manipulated us both. I educated you both, he replied smoothly. Sarah learned the truth about human nature, how quickly love turns to abandonment, how easily family bonds can be severed. You, Margaret, learned to live with consequences, to channel your guilt into useful pursuits. But Sarah was standing now, moving away from her easel with jerky, unpredictable movements. 40 years, she said, her voice climbing toward hysteria. 40 years I thought she chose him over me. 40 years believing no one loved me enough to keep looking. Margaret felt the first spark of hope she'd experienced since waking up in this nightmare. Sarah, listen to me. We never stopped loving you. Mom died still hoping you'd come home. Dad? Shut up! Sarah spun around, and Margaret saw her sister clearly for the first time. Not the broken victim or willing collaborator, but something far more dangerous. Someone who had just realized the careful structure of her world was built on lies. Both of you, just shut up. Dr. Rothschild's confidence flickered for the first time. Sarah, calm down. You know the truth now. Nothing's changed about our work. Everything's changed. Sarah grabbed one of the larger paintbrushes from her table, its wooden handle worn smooth from years of use. You said she abandoned me by choice. You said my family forgot me because I didn't matter. But you made it happen. You orchestrated everything. Margaret saw the moment Dr. Rothschild realized his mistake. He'd been so focused on destroying Margaret psychologically that he'd forgotten Sarah's conditioning depended on believing she'd been genuinely abandoned. By revealing his manipulation, he'd shattered the foundation of his own control. Sarah, put that down, he said, his grandfatherly voice taking on an edge of command. You're confused, emotional. We need to discuss this rationally. But Sarah was beyond rational discussion. 40 years of carefully maintained psychological balance was crumbling in real time, and Margaret could see her sister's mind fracturing along the fault lines of old trauma and fresh revelation. I painted them, Sarah whispered, staring at the portraits surrounding them. All your students, all your victims. I documented your work because I thought I understood it. But I was just another one, wasn't I? Just another child you broke for your research. She raised the paintbrush like a weapon, its metal ferrule catching the candlelight, and Margaret realized that after 4 decades of captivity, her sister was finally ready to fight back. The paintbrush trembled in Sarah's grip as she faced Dr. Rothschild, and Margaret watched 40 years of psychological conditioning war with a sister's rage. The candlelight flickered across Sarah's face, revealing expressions Margaret hadn't seen since childhood: defiance, hurt, the desperate fury of betrayal. You taught me that love was weakness, Sarah said, her voice shaking. That attachment led to abandonment, that the only truth was what I could see with my own eyes. She gestured toward the portraits covering the walls. But you were the lie, weren't you? You were always the lie. Dr. Rothschild stepped backward, his hands raised in what might have been surrender or preparation to defend himself. Sarah, think about what you're saying. Everything I've taught you about human nature, it's all still true. Your sister's choices, her selfishness, the way your family moved on. Stop. Sarah's command cut through his manipulation like a blade. Don't you dare tell me what's true anymore. You made a 9-year-old girl choose between family and a boy. You kidnapped a 7-year-old and spent 40 years convincing her she deserved it. Margaret felt something shifting in her chest. Not hope exactly, but recognition. This was Sarah, the real Sarah, fighting her way back through decades of psychological poison. The sister who had once stood up to the neighborhood bullies, who had refused to let anyone hurt the stray cats she fed behind their house. "Sarah," Margaret whispered, "you were never abandoned. Not really. Not by choice." But as Sarah turned toward her, Margaret saw something in her sister's eyes that made her blood freeze. It wasn't just anger at Dr. Rothschild. It was rage at everyone, at the psychologist who had stolen her life, at the sister who had failed to protect her, at the world that had allowed it all to happen. 40 years, Maggie," Sarah said, using the childhood nickname like a curse. 40 years of believing I wasn't worth saving. Do you know what that does to a person? What it makes them capable of? Dr. Rothschild seized on the moment of division. "You see? She's exactly what I made her to be. The perfect demonstration of environmental conditioning over genetic predisposition. Your sister isn't a victim anymore, Margaret. She's my masterpiece." The words hung in the air like poison gas, and Margaret watched Sarah's face transform. The brief flicker of her childhood self vanished, replaced by something cold and calculating, something that looked disturbingly familiar from Margaret's years of studying criminal psychology. "Your masterpiece?" Sarah laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "You think you understand what you created?" She moved to one of the covered canvases Margaret hadn't noticed before, pulling away a paint-stained sheet with theatrical flourish. Underneath was a portrait that made Margaret's stomach lurch, Dr. Rothschild himself, but rendered with such meticulous attention to his flaws and cruelties that it became a map of evil. Every line in his face spoke of manipulation. Every detail of his eyes revealed the emptiness within. "I've been studying you too, Edmund," Sarah said conversationally. 40 years of observation. Every facial expression when you thought I wasn't looking. Every unconscious gesture that revealed your true nature. You taught me to see people as they really are. And I've been seeing you." Dr. Rothschild stared at his painted image with something approaching fear. "Sarah, what are you?" "You're not a researcher," Sarah continued, circling him with predatory grace. "You're not even particularly intelligent. You're just a pathetic old man who never got over being ignored as a child. All your talk about psychological conditioning and environmental factors, you're not creating anything. You're just acting out your own damage over and over again." Margaret felt the atmosphere in the room shift fundamentally. The dynamic between captor and victim was dissolving, replaced by something far more dangerous. Sarah wasn't just fighting back. She was dismantling Dr. Rothschild with the very tools he had taught her. Every victim you took, every family you destroyed, it was never about science or understanding human nature, Sarah pressed on. It was about making other people feel as powerless as you did when Mommy didn't love you enough. "Stop it," Dr. Rothschild snapped, his mask of clinical detachment finally cracking. "You don't understand." "I understand perfectly." Sarah's voice dropped to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than any scream. "You're not God. You're not a genius. You're just another damaged child who never grew up." The revelation that destroyed everything wasn't about Margaret's guilt, or Sarah's conditioning, or even the 40 years of manipulation. It was simpler and more devastating than that. Dr. Rothschild, the man who had positioned himself as the master manipulator pulling strings from the shadows, was nothing more than a broken human being perpetuating cycles of trauma because he lacked the imagination to break them. And in exposing him, Sarah had revealed what she had truly become, not his victim or his masterpiece, but something entirely beyond his control or understanding. The student had long since surpassed the teacher, and Dr. Rothschild was only just beginning to understand what that meant. The silence that followed Sarah's psychological dissection of Dr. Rothschild stretched like a taut wire, vibrating with unspoken threats. Margaret watched her sister prowl around their captor, noting how Sarah's movements had taken on the calculated grace of a predator who had finally recognized her own power. Dr. Rothschild's hands shook as he reached for his recording device, as if documentation could somehow restore his crumbling authority. "This is fascinating," he said, his voice pitched too high, the subject attempting to reverse the power dynamic through projection. "Sarah, you're displaying classic symptoms of Stockholm Syndrome breakdown." Still talking like a textbook, Sarah interrupted, her tone almost pitying. "Even now, when everything's falling apart, you can't just be human. You have to hide behind your theories and your technical language because the real you is too pathetic to face. Margaret found herself caught between terror and fascination. This wasn't the broken victim she'd expected to rescue, nor was it the willing collaborator she'd discovered. This was something new, someone who had learned to weaponize her own trauma with surgical precision. "Sarah," Margaret ventured carefully, "what are you planning to do?" Her sister's smile was beautiful and terrible. "I'm going to give Edmund exactly what he deserves. The perfect end to his life's work." She moved to another covered canvas, larger than the others. "You see, I haven't just been painting portraits all these years. I've been documenting everything. Every victim, every method, every location where bodies are buried." Dr. Rothschild went pale. "You wouldn't..." "Wouldn't what? Turn you in?" Sarah's laugh was pure venom. "Oh, Edmund, you still don't understand what you created, do you? I'm not going to turn you in. I'm going to complete your research." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Margaret felt ice forming in her veins as she began to comprehend what her sister was suggesting. "The ultimate question you never answered," Sarah continued, pulling away the sheet with ceremonial slowness. Underneath was a detailed map of the underground tunnels, marked with locations Margaret recognized from crime scene reports spanning decades. What happens when your perfectly conditioned subject finally turns the methodology on you? Dr. Rothschild stumbled backward, his clinical composure completely shattered. "This is impossible. The conditioning protocols, the psychological frameworks. You can't overcome 40 years of behavioral modification." "You're right," Sarah agreed pleasantly. "I can't overcome it, but I can redirect it." She traced her finger along the tunnel map, following pathways that led deeper underground than Margaret had known existed. "You taught me that human beings are just complex machines responding to environmental stimuli. You showed me how to study them, how to predict their behavior, how to control their responses." Margaret watched in growing horror as Sarah opened a cabinet she hadn't noticed before, revealing surgical instruments arranged with the same meticulous care as her art supplies. Everything was clean, organized, ready for use. "The beautiful irony," Sarah continued, selecting a scalpel and testing its edge against her thumb, "is that you were absolutely right about environmental conditioning. You just never considered that I might learn to control the environment." "This isn't you," Dr. Rothschild said desperately. "This is trauma response, displacement behavior. You're projecting your anger onto me instead of processing it appropriately." "Still trying to analyze me?" Sarah's voice carried genuine amusement. "Even now? God, you really are pathetic." She moved closer to him, the scalpel catching the candlelight. "Let me help you understand something, Edmund. I'm not your victim anymore. I'm not your student. I'm your replacement." The word hit Margaret like a physical blow. Replacement. Not revenge, not escape, not rescue. Replacement. "Sarah, no," Margaret said, fighting against the restraints holding her to the wheelchair. "This isn't the answer. You can stop this. You can choose to be different." For a moment, Sarah's expression softened, and Margaret saw a ghost of the girl who had shared her bedroom, who had whispered secrets in the dark. But then her sister's gaze fell on the recording device still clutched in Dr. Rothschild's trembling hand, and the moment of humanity vanished. "He recorded everything, Maggie," Sarah said quietly. "Every scream, every breakdown, every moment when I begged for my family. 40 years of documentation. He was going to publish it all as research." Her voice hardened. "Well, now he gets to be the final subject." Dr. Rothschild made a desperate lunge for the tunnel entrance, but Sarah moved with inhuman speed, blocking his path. The predator and prey roles had completely reversed, and Margaret realized with sick certainty that her sister's psychological conditioning hadn't been broken, it had been perfected. "Please," Dr. Rothschild whispered, and for the first time since Margaret had met him, he sounded genuinely afraid. Sarah smiled, and Margaret saw 40 years of careful planning crystallizing into action. "Now you're ready to begin your real education, Edmund. And Margaret?" She turned toward her sister with that same terrible smile. "You're going to witness every moment. After all, isn't that what you do? Study the criminal mind?" The point of no return wasn't a decision anymore. It was a scalpel in Sarah's steady hand. Climax. The scalpel gleamed like a prayer in the candlelight, and Margaret understood with crystalline clarity that she was witnessing the birth of something monstrous, not in Sarah, but in herself. Because as she watched her sister advance on their tormentor, Margaret felt a surge of satisfaction that made her stomach turn. "Sarah, stop," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. 40 years of guilt warred with 40 years of rage, and Margaret discovered she didn't know which side she wanted to win. "You want to study criminal psychology, Maggie?" Sarah's tone was conversational, almost gentle. "Here's your primary source material. Watch closely." Dr. Rothschild pressed himself against the tunnel wall, his academic arrogance finally stripped away to reveal the sniveling coward beneath. "You can't do this. I have colleagues who know where I am, people who will look for me." "No, you don't," Sarah replied with devastating certainty. "I've spent 40 years learning everything about you, Edmund. Your colleagues think you're in Switzerland at a conference. Your housekeeper believes you're visiting family. Your few remaining friends stopped caring about your whereabouts years ago." She paused, studying his face with clinical interest. "Funny how you engineered your own isolation so perfectly, almost like you wanted to disappear." Margaret felt the truth of it settling in her bones. Dr. Rothschild hadn't just been a predator. He had been a profoundly lonely man creating elaborate scenarios to feel powerful because real human connection was beyond his reach. The recognition didn't make his crimes forgivable, but it made them pathetically human. "Sarah," Margaret said, surprising herself with the steadiness in her voice, "look at me." Her sister turned, and for one suspended moment, Margaret saw past the decades of conditioning to the 7-year-old girl who used to crawl into her bed during thunderstorms. "I failed you," Margaret said simply. "Not because I was manipulated into it, not because I was too young to know better, but because when it mattered most, I chose my own happiness over your safety. That's the truth. That's what I have to live with." Sarah's grip on the scalpel tightened. "And what am I supposed to do with that confession, Maggie? Frame it next to my 40 years of suffering?" "You're supposed to understand that I became everything I am because of that failure," Margaret pressed on. "Every killer I studied, every profile I built, every case I solved, I was looking for you. I was trying to understand how someone could steal a child from her family and live with themselves afterward." Dr. Rothschild seized the moment of distraction, making another desperate dash for the tunnel entrance. But Sarah anticipated the move, intercepting him with fluid grace. When she spoke, her voice carried the patience of someone explaining simple arithmetic to a slow student. "The fascinating thing about studying you all these years, Edmund, is watching how you justify your actions. You convinced yourself you were conducting research, advancing human knowledge, serving some greater purpose." She pressed the scalpel against his throat, just hard enough to draw a thin line of blood. "But the truth is so much simpler. You were just a damaged little boy who never learned to play well with others." Margaret watched her sister's face in the shifting candlelight and saw something that made her heart break all over again. Sarah wasn't enjoying this. There was no sadistic pleasure in her expression, no triumph in her movements. She looked tired, bone-deep, soul-weary tired. "Sarah," Margaret whispered, "you don't have to be what he made you." "Don't I?" Sarah's laugh held no humor. "What exactly do you think I should be instead? The normal woman I might have grown up to become? The sister who could have had a family, a career, a life that wasn't built on other people's suffering?" She shook her head. "That person died 40 years ago. This is all that's left." Dr. Rothschild whimpered as the scalpel pressed deeper, and Margaret felt the moment crystallizing around them like spun glass. Everything that came next would define not just how Sarah's story ended, but who Margaret chose to be in the aftermath of revelation. "You're wrong," Margaret said, her voice cutting through the underground chamber with surprising strength. "You're not what he made you. You're what you chose to survive becoming. And if you do this, if you kill him, then you'll be choosing to become something else entirely." Sarah's hands stilled. "And what would that be?" "Free," Margaret said quietly. "You'd be choosing to be free of him forever, not his victim, not his creation, not even his judge, just free, for a heartbeat that stretched into eternity, The three of them hung suspended in the candlelit darkness, predator and prey and witness, past and present and future, all waiting to see which version of truth would triumph. The scalpel trembled in Sarah's grip like a compass needle seeking true north. The scalpel fell from Sarah's fingers, clattering against the stone floor with the finality of a church bell. The sound echoed through the tunnels like an absolution, and Margaret watched 40 years of carefully constructed purpose crumble from her sister's face. "Free," Sarah repeated, the word foreign on her tongue. She stepped back from Dr. Rothschild, who collapsed against the wall, gasping and clutching his throat. "I don't know what that means anymore." Margaret felt her restraints give way. Sarah had been loosening them while talking, she realized. As circulation returned to her hands, she stood on unsteady legs and approached her sister with the careful movements of someone approaching a wounded animal. "We'll figure it out together," Margaret said. The weeks that followed blurred together like watercolors in rain. Police interviews, psychological evaluations, media attention that felt surreal and invasive. Dr. Rothschild faced charges for 11 murders spanning 4 decades, his elaborate research facility exposed as what it truly was, a serial killer's playground dressed in academic pretense. Sarah testified with the same clinical precision she had learned in captivity, her voice steady as she detailed atrocities that made seasoned detectives excuse themselves from the room. But Margaret saw what others missed, the slight tremor in her sister's hands when she thought no one was watching, the way she flinched from unexpected sounds. They found Sarah a place in a private facility outside Chicago, somewhere she could begin the impossible work of healing. Margaret visited every Tuesday, bringing books and art supplies and stories about their parents' later years. Slowly, carefully, they began reconstructing the bridge that had been burned 40 years ago. "Do you dream about him?" Sarah asked during one of these visits, her fingers working charcoal across paper with the automatic motions of decades of practice. Margaret considered lying, then decided they'd had enough deception between them. "Every night. But not the way you'd think. I dream about the psychology conferences where I presented my research on criminal behavior. All those years, I was essentially teaching other people to understand monsters like him." She paused, watching her sister's face. "I built a career on the very thing that destroyed our family." Sarah's hand stilled on the paper. "Are you asking for forgiveness?" "No," Margaret said quietly. "I'm asking if you think we can live with what we've become." The drawing Sarah had been working on came into focus. Not another portrait or map, but something Margaret hadn't seen her sister create before. It was a landscape, simple and clean, showing a horizon line where earth met sky. No hidden meanings, no encrypted messages, just the possibility of distance and open space. "I've been thinking about what normal people do," Sarah said. "People who weren't stolen or guilty or obsessed with understanding evil. People who just exist without all this weight." She gestured toward the drawing. "I don't know if I can be that, but maybe I can try." Margaret felt tears she hadn't allowed herself to cry in 40 years. "We both can." The last time Margaret visited the abandoned Menard facility, she brought gasoline and matches. The wall drawings that had led her to this revelation, Gacy's art, Sarah's hidden messages, the elaborate map of one man's evil, all of it would burn. Some stories, she decided, needed to end rather than be preserved. As flames consumed the solitary confinement cells, Margaret thought about the child she had been, the woman she had become, and the sister she had found and lost and found again. The fire cast dancing shadows on the walls, but for once she wasn't looking for patterns or hidden meanings in the darkness. 6 months later, Margaret received a letter with no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a charcoal drawing, 2 figures walking along a path that stretched toward a distant horizon. The figures were simplified, almost childlike in their execution, but unmistakably sisters. Beneath the drawing, in Sarah's careful handwriting, were 4 words, "Still learning to walk." Margaret framed the drawing and hung it in her office, replacing the criminal psychology certificates and awards that had defined her professional life. When colleagues asked about it, she told them it was a reminder that some research had personal costs too high to justify. She never saw Sarah again in person, but the letters continued. Updates from different cities, different treatment centers, different attempts at building a life from the fragments of what remained. Margaret wrote back, sharing her own struggles with retirement, with purpose, with learning to sleep without the weight of other people's darkness pressing against her dreams. The story would have shocked her colleagues, the forensic psychiatrist whose sister became both victim and near perpetrator, whose life's work had been an elaborate form of penance. But Margaret found she no longer cared what other people thought about the neat categories they used to organize human behavior. Some wounds were too deep to heal completely. Some losses were too profound to ever truly overcome. But sometimes, in the space between damage and wholeness, two people could find something worth keeping. Not forgiveness exactly, but a shared understanding that they had both survived the unsurvivable. And perhaps, Margaret thought as she watched snow fall past her office window, that was enough.